Hidden deep in the jagged peaks of Tora Bora, an elite USA Army unit vanished without a trace, or so the official reports claim. But what really happened inside the mountain caves? Whispers of unseen watchers, shifting tunnels, and shadows that move on their own have haunted soldiers' accounts for decades. Today on Battlefield Secrets, we uncover the chilling story of the Watchers of Tora Bora, a psychological horror born from the very real dangers of war. Stay with us, because some secrets were never meant to be discovered. The morning air hung thick with a mist that obscured the jagged ridges of the Tora Bora Mountains. A U.S. Army unit, comprised of a reinforced infantry squad and 2 scout teams, assembled at the base of the ascent, their gear methodically checked against standard mountain warfare protocols. Each soldier's kit was weighed, weapons calibrated, and communications devices tested, the hum of tactical radios punctuating the quiet. The unit had been briefed extensively. Intelligence indicated insurgent activity deep within the cave networks, but local sources whispered of the Watchers, entities said to haunt these peaks. Officers noted the warnings with clinical detachment, recording observations in the official log, yet a subtle tension lingered in the soldiers' measured movements. As the team began its climb, frost crunched beneath boots and the wind carried a biting chill down the narrow paths. The terrain was treacherous, loose scree slid beneath their steps, and natural handholds were slick with condensation. Scout reports intermittently interrupted the static of handheld radios, detailing formations of rock that suggested both natural erosion and deliberate sculpting. But when observed directly, these formations appeared to shift subtly, shadows stretching and retreating as if aware of human scrutiny. The fog condensed at higher elevations, wrapping the ridges in a gray shroud, muffling sound and amplifying the echo of each footfall. Birds and wildlife were conspicuously absent, leaving only the whine of the wind through the jagged rock faces. Leadership maintained strict adherence to tactical climbing formations, spacing soldiers to avoid exposure while keeping the unit cohesive. Ropes were anchored at unstable outcrops, and scouts frequently paused to chart bearings on their maps. Each notation, from slope angle to estimated travel time, was meticulously recorded. Yet, despite the scientific attention to detail, a creeping unease began to permeate the squad. Shadows along the ridge seemed to move independently, not in accordance with the sun or terrain. When one soldier shifted his gaze, the shadows vanished, only to reappear moments later at the periphery of vision. Reports were logged with detached precision, but the subtext of fear was unmistakable. Communication with base camp remained intermittent, radio signals occasionally distorted as though the mountain itself interfered with transmissions. The unit maintained a clinical mindset, noting anomalies, recording times, and cataloging weather patterns, but the soldiers could not ignore the subjective sense of being observed. A scout team, tasked with flanking the northern ridge, returned with an uneasy report. Faint impressions in snow and rock formations suggesting movement across the cliffs where no one had been. Though it could have been wind or natural erosion, the officer's notes remained factual yet pointed. Evidence of observation present. Unconfirmed source. As night approached, temperature plummeted and fog thickened to near opacity. The unit set temporary bivouac positions along the ridge, maintaining watch rotations and logging environmental conditions. Despite disciplined procedure, unease persisted, as if the mountain's sheer faces were surveilling them. The final observation of the day, entered in the field log with measured detachment, recorded shadows coalescing along the crest of the ridge, vanishing when directly approached. The line concluded with an unnerving notation. They were not alone, and someone had been watching from the heights. The mouth of the Tora Bora cave system gaped like a jagged wound in the mountainside, swallowing the last rays of daylight. The unit advanced cautiously, boots echoing against slick stone floors, each footstep magnified in the labyrinthine passages. Headlamps cut through the gloom in narrow beams, revealing damp walls striated with mineral veins and stalactites dripping cold condensation. The soldiers maintained a strict formation, fingers brushing against rock walls for orientation, maps and laser rangefinders documenting each turn and chamber. Every twist of the tunnels was meticulously logged, though the irregular topology of the mountains made standard mapping a constant challenge. Historical accounts indicated that these caves had been used for smuggling and as insurgent hideouts, but the soldiers quickly realized that no recorded hazard could account for the oppressive atmosphere pressing against their senses. As they progressed deeper, sounds became unreliable. Echoes warped the rhythm of footsteps. A tap from one soldier resonated multiple times, out of sync with reality. Distant knocks, too regular to be random, prompted head turns, but no source could be identified. Whispers slithered through narrow shafts, indistinct yet punctuated by the occasional clear syllable, a name, a question, a command. Some men froze, listening as their own voices seemed to call them further into the labyrinth. Officers logged the occurrences clinically, noting times, tunnel coordinates, and environmental readings, but the mounting unease seeped into every line. The concrete discipline of military procedure clashed with the growing sense of intrusion. The mountain itself seemed aware of their presence. Temperature dropped sharply in deeper caverns, and pockets of icy air carried moisture that condensed on gear and helmets. Moisture made navigation treacherous. Sliding rock and narrow ledges demanded constant vigilance. Yet, it was not the terrain that unnerved the men most. Shadows moved inconsistently, flickering along walls in ways that defied the headlamps. One soldier, tasked with scanning a side passage, froze as he heard his own voice calling him by name, beckoning him toward a tunnel that led into complete darkness. His colleagues shouted, but the sound seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously. The officers recorded these anomalies as observational notes, careful to maintain archival detachment, but the repeated phenomenon could not be ignored. Attempts at verbal communication became strained. Echoes distorted orders, creating the illusion of conflicting commands. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps behind them even when the passage was empty. Some began to feel as though the tunnels themselves were shifting, elongating, or compressing in ways that defied the surveyed maps. Each corridor, each junction, seemed to rearrange subtly, disorienting the men and forcing constant recalibration. Mental strain increased. Even seasoned troops experienced micropauses, questioning whether sounds were external or internal projections of fear. Every data point was logged: air pressure, humidity, tunnel width, but the subtle psychological manipulations remained unquantifiable. By the time the unit reached what appeared to be a large chamber, the whispers intensified, and the flickering headlamps revealed more shadows than should have existed. Officers convened briefly, noting the anomalies without speculation, but the unease was tangible. A scout at the rear reported again, in a voice trembling with the edge of terror, that he had heard his own voice calling him deeper into the cave. The field log closed with precise language yet undeniable dread. The mountain itself was speaking. The unit pressed deeper into the Tora Bora caves, their formation tight but strained with tension. The scout assigned to the northern passage, Private Reynolds, fell behind briefly to inspect a narrow fissure, reporting routine observations via handheld radio. Minutes later, his voice ceased abruptly. Static filled the channel. Officers immediately ordered a recall and a methodical search of the surrounding tunnels. Headlamps cut thin beams across damp walls, reflecting off mineral streaks, but no trace of Reynolds was found. The sound of their own movements echoed unnaturally, each step amplified in the twisting corridors, masking any faint signs of the missing soldier. Log entries were made with clinical precision: exact time of disappearance, last known coordinates, and immediate response actions. The team executed standard missing person protocols, deploying 2 squads in overlapping sweeps, maintaining radio silence except for updates. Thermal cameras and handheld GPS trackers were active, yet the readings remained static. Reynolds' movements seemed to have erased themselves. No footprints, no disturbance in dust, no thermal signature lingered. Officers noted each checkpoint and intersection, comparing maps against the team's current positions. The cave's complex topology complicated the search. Multiple tunnels intersected, and the angles distorted sound, making it nearly impossible to gauge the distance or direction of echoes. Despite systematic sweeps, the scouts' presence had vanished entirely. Panic began to infiltrate the unit, though official logs maintained a detached tone. Soldiers whispered nervously, glancing at shadows that stretched and shifted unnaturally along walls. Some swore they glimpsed a figure at the edge of their vision, only to see empty rock when looked at directly. Equipment began behaving inexplicably. Reynolds' helmet light, left on a ledge moment earlier, now lay across the floor several meters away. His rifle, carefully secured in a sling, had been repositioned, angled toward an unseen tunnel. Officers documented these anomalies without conjecture, but the psychological weight was evident. The soldiers were aware that the disappearance defied normal patterns of movement, tracking, or environmental interference. Attempts to retrace the scout's path yielded further anomalies. Dust on the ground, lightly disturbed before, now appeared untouched. Footprints that should have been there vanished. Radios emitted faint static bursts, sometimes forming what seemed like whispered syllables, though no pattern was identifiable. Soldiers' logs reflected precise observational notes, but with a growing acknowledgement that standard procedures were failing. Every data point, headlamp readings, compass bearings, atmospheric sensors, confirmed the cave's physical consistency, yet Reynolds remained absent. The officers noted the discrepancy clinically, marking the anomaly for further investigation. No observable cause for disappearance. Equipment displaced. As hours passed, the psychological strain intensified. Soldiers began muttering about being watched, shadows flickering in ways the logs recorded but could not rationalize. The officers maintained detached language, noting every report with timestamps and geospatial coordinates, but the repetition of anomalies eroded confidence. The deeper passages seemed alive, folding space and sound, turning the search into a disorienting march through a labyrinth that defied both memory and map. Every turn revealed nothing yet suggested presence. By the time the last corridor was swept, Reynolds' gear was found in a side tunnel he had never reported inspecting, helmet light casting long, static shadows. Officers recorded the finding precisely, noting, equipment relocated, no personnel observed. The log concluded with the stark, clinical acknowledgement of threat beyond comprehension. They had taken one, and were waiting for the rest. The team advanced deeper into the labyrinthine caves of Tora Bora, their headlamps casting narrow beams that bounced off jagged walls and uneven stone floors. As they rounded a corner, Sergeant Miller paused abruptly, signaling the others to halt. Before them, faint etchings glimmered in the dirt-streaked rock, angular symbols carved with precision, yet entirely alien in form. Soldiers crouched, photographing and sketching the inscriptions with clinical care, documenting each groove and fissure. Chalk dust from their hands rose in the dim light, mixing with the cave's natural moisture to form a ghostly haze. Officers recorded time, position, and dimensions, comparing the etchings to known tribal, ancient, or wartime markings, yet found no match. The logs remained detached, noting the presence of symbols that did not correspond to any recognized script. As the team methodically documented the walls, the cave seemed to react. Shadows along the periphery of their vision flickered and shifted with uncanny precision, tracing the soldiers' movements as they moved from one symbol to the next. Night vision scopes revealed fleeting silhouettes that appeared to mimic the soldiers' gestures, crouches, and turns, yet vanished instantly when observed directly. Officers logged these anomalies in a clinical, almost clinical tone. Shadowed figures observed tracking unit movements. Source unidentified. The psychological weight began to press on the men. Whispers of unease threaded through their communications, though no vocalization was recorded in the formal logs. Every step and gesture was mirrored, as if the mountain itself were cataloging their actions. The soldiers attempted to map the symbols, connecting them with lines on handheld graphing sheets, only to notice emergent patterns that mirrored their own formation and patrol routes. Each triangle, spiral, or glyph seemed to echo the team's path through the tunnels, responding subtly to their presence. Equipment readings, thermal, seismic, and magnetic, showed nothing irregular, reinforcing the unnerving notion that the responsiveness was not natural. The log entries meticulously noted the absence of detectable environmental factors, marking the patterning as an unexplained variable. Officers encouraged methodical documentation while suppressing speculation, yet the clinical words on paper could not mask the instinctive terror creeping through the ranks. Occasionally, The dripping of water from stalactites created a rhythm that coincided with the soldiers' footsteps, amplifying the sense of deliberate orchestration. Attempts to isolate the pattern through static observation failed. Any attempt to remain motionless caused the symbols to seem to shift, subtle grooves extending or contracting, though measurements revealed the rock itself remained unchanged. The team's notebooks filled with precise drawings and annotations. Yet each new symbol observed only reinforced the perception that the cave was not merely a physical space, but an active observer, cataloging behavior. Notes included comparisons to historical cave markings used for wartime communication or tribal rites, but all findings were inconclusive. By the end of the day's sweep, the soldiers' unease was palpable. Every corner, every wall surface suggested eyes that could follow, and every recorded symbol reinforced the sensation of being mirrored. Officers summarized findings in detached language, cataloging measurements, sketches, and timestamps. Yet even the logs betrayed subtle tremors of disbelief. The symbols responded to the team's exact motions. A faint wind hissed through fissures, stirring dust over the newly inscribed markings, and a distant drip echoed like a metronome. The final line of the report closed with an unsettling acknowledgement, the type of note that would haunt all future readers. The mountain was rewriting them in its language. The unit advanced cautiously through the twisting tunnels of Tora Bora, each step echoing faintly against the damp rock walls. Headlamps cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the uneven floors and jagged formations, yet shadows clung to the corners like lingering ghosts. Without warning, a flare erupted along the western corridor, a small fire, dancing unnaturally on the stone floor. Soldiers reacted immediately, drawing extinguishers and attempting to suppress the flames, only to watch them vanish before any water or chemical touched them. Moments later, another flare ignited deeper in the passage, separated by a twisting chute, leaving the team disoriented and questioning the integrity of their senses. The log entries captured the phenomena with clinical detachment. Flare observed without discernible ignition source. Relocation of flame instantaneous and untraceable. Smoke filled the tunnels rapidly, coiling along stalactites and clinging to the walls, carrying a faint sulfuric tang. Heat distorted the surrounding rock, creating wavering mirages that compounded the crew's sense of unease. Soldiers measured temperatures and ventilation flow, attempting to reconcile these readings with known cave fire behavior, yet all instruments indicated no consistent source or fuel. Officers documented each flare with timestamps and spatial coordinates, noting anomalies in wind patterns and airflow. Attempts to contain or predict the flames failed entirely. Extinguishing one flare invariably coincided with the appearance of another along a different, previously clear corridor. What unsettled the unit most were the silhouettes that emerged within the firelight. Figures materialized in the flickering flames, soldiers of a century past, clad in uniforms that no longer existed, their weapons raised in combat stances. Observers reported seeing trenches, bayonets, and the stiff posture of soldiers frozen mid-charge. The shapes shifted unervingly, as if reenacting battles long buried under the mountain's stone. Photographic equipment recorded bursts of light and heat, but the human forms appeared inconsistently, as if manifesting solely for perception by the team. Notes in the log maintained formal language, silhouettes consistent with historical combat uniforms observed, no physical matter present. The fire's unpredictable movements forced the soldiers into a defensive pattern, scanning every corner and hallway while maintaining operational cohesion. Radio communications between squad elements noted increasing anxiety. Terse, clipped phrases detailing sudden flares, heat bursts, and movement of figures within smoke. Units attempted standard cave navigation protocols, marking pathways, tracking steps, and deploying markers, but each fire seemed to anticipate their maneuvers, appearing just beyond the last recorded position. Officers remained detached in reports, cataloging actions, distances, and observations in meticulous detail while acknowledging the psychological toll on the men. As the patrol pressed forward, the combination of smoke, heat, and spectral silhouettes created a sensory environment where rational analysis failed to account for perception. Every flare and ghostly figure seemed intentionally placed, guiding, or manipulating the soldiers' path through the tunnel network. The final note in the official log captured the dread with an eerie economy of words. The dead were lighting the way or leading them to doom. Beyond this entry, audio recordings from the patrol captured the faintest echoes of long-past battle cries, mingling with the hissing of phantom fires and the trembling breaths of living men. The Tora Bora tunnels had become more than a physical labyrinth. They had transformed into a psychological crucible. The unit's pace slowed, each step measured against the oppressive drip of water and the distant echo of footsteps that never matched the formation. Headlamps flickered across the jagged rock walls, illuminating faces drawn tight with exhaustion, eyes darting at shadows that seemed to move independently. The officers recorded each incident with meticulous detachment, hallucinations, whispered accusations, and the growing sense of betrayal among soldiers. Private Allen reports seeing Lieutenant Harris walking ahead of the formation despite all personnel accounted for. One entry read, accompanied by measured notes on environmental conditions. Voices whispered from the dark, echoing unnaturally, sometimes repeating phrases the men themselves had spoken hours before. Soldiers began questioning each other, accusing comrades of deliberately misleading the group or tampering with equipment. Arguments erupted in low, tense murmurs, escalating quickly in the confined spaces. One soldier, eyes wild, claimed he saw a duplicate of Corporal Vega staring from a shadowed corner. Panic rose, training fractured, and the team's cohesion began to crumble. Officers noted the pattern clinically. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and stress produced erratic behavior. Yet none could account for the consistent appearance of doubles. The hallucinations intensified with each turn. Shadows on the walls mimicked every gesture, but slightly delayed, as if mocking the men. When Private Carson raised his weapon at what he believed was a watcher, he fired at Sergeant Miller, striking him in the shoulder before the illusion dissolved. Adrenaline surged through the unit, yet the shooting was documented with detached professionalism. Friendly fire incident. Subject disoriented by perceived threat. Minor injury sustained. Panic intertwined with disbelief, creating an environment where logic struggled against instinctual fear. The tunnels themselves seemed complicit. Echoing footsteps were heard when the unit paused. Dripping water accelerated during moments of tension, synchronized with the men's heartbeat. Even the layout of the caverns appeared to shift subtly under observation, as if to amplify disorientation. Observers recorded anomalies. Gear left untouched would later be found in impossible positions, and the path taken seemed to loop back on itself. Each soldier's mind became a landscape of mistrust, the boundary between reality and illusion collapsing with every step. Psychological stress tests noted the escalation. Sleep deprivation, high-stakes alertness, and confined spaces amplified paranoia. The men murmured about shapes at the periphery, faces peering from shadows that vanished upon approach. Every reflection in water puddles or metallic surfaces seemed to move independently, showing doubles that weren't there. Reports emphasized that these hallucinations were not isolated. Multiple soldiers independently described the same phenomena, suggesting a shared psychological contagion or something more sinister. By the end of the patrol log, the team's entries were terse, fragmented, reflecting the fraying of order. Accusations, frightened laughter, terse warnings. The officer's final note captured the essence of the day's terror with chilling precision. The Watchers were feeding on their fear. Within the tunnels of Tora Bora, the mountains themselves seemed to observe, exploiting the soldiers' vulnerability, turning their own minds into the most treacherous battlefield. The unit pressed deeper into the Tora Bora cave system, where the natural light of the mountains no longer penetrated, and even the headlamps cast only small, trembling circles on the blackened walls. Sound itself seemed absorbed by the cavernous space. Footsteps echoed in unpredictable patterns, disorienting even the most experienced soldiers. Maps and GPS devices proved unreliable as the tunnels twisted and intersected with labyrinthine complexity, forcing reliance on manual pacing and compass bearings, though both seemed to falter inexplicably. The officers' logs recorded every deviation with clinical detachment, noting navigation methods compromised, auditory cues unreliable, spatial disorientation observed across multiple personnel. Radios, intended as lifelines to command, emitted only static punctuated by faint, unintelligible murmurs. The voices were irregular but strangely coherent, sometimes repeating fragments of the soldier's own speech or orders moments before they were given. A private noted in his journal that he heard, distinctly, his own command echo back from the tunnel system, instructing him to step in a particular direction before he had moved. Instruments malfunctioned in tandem. Compasses spun, battery levels dropped inexplicably, and electronic lights flickered in synchronization with the voices. Officers meticulously documented each anomaly, treating them as environmental variables, yet an unsettling pattern emerged. The cave seemed to anticipate every movement of the unit. Faint, unnatural lights occasionally shimmered in the distance, cold and colorless, casting long, distorted shadows along the rough stone walls. Soldiers described glimpsing silhouettes that mimicked their own postures, but always at the periphery, vanishing when approached. Footsteps that matched the cadence of the men echoed from areas that should have been empty. The officers recorded repeated visual phenomena observed, movements consistent with personnel patterns yet originating from uninhabited locations. Psychological stress began to manifest. The men's movements slowed. Hesitation and second-guessing became pervasive. Whispered warnings about the mountain watching circulated among the group, though each remark was noted clinically. Fear logged, no conclusions drawn. Attempts to maintain order proved difficult. Patrol formations broke under uncertainty. Soldiers clumped instinctively, eyes scanning the darkness for the source of subtle cues. Even the most stoic officers admitted in private logs that the environment was shaping behavior beyond any rational explanation. Personnel exhibit anticipatory responses to events not yet observable, standard procedures insufficient to mitigate disorientation. Every corner of the abyss seemed designed to manipulate perception, creating a sense of predetermination and inevitability. The cave's silence was punctuated by the occasional tap or distant knock, sometimes in rhythm with steps already taken, sometimes just ahead, yet always precise, as if the tunnels themselves calculated and mirrored the unit's path. By the final recorded observation, the pattern had become undeniable. Movements, decisions, and even the soldier's speech were mirrored almost before they occurred, creating a pervasive sense of being watched and guided simultaneously. Equipment and sensory perception failed to provide reassurance. Every attempt at rational navigation was undermined by the cave's anticipatory responses. The officers concluded the report with a terse, chilling note. The mountain anticipated every move before they made it. Within the depths of Tora Bora, the unit realized that the caverns were no longer merely geological formations. They were sentient in their own malevolent fashion, dictating not just the path but the thoughts and actions of those who dared to enter. The main entrance to the cave system shuddered violently before collapsing in a thunderous roar, sending clouds of dust and fragmented limestone into the narrow corridor. Soldiers were thrown to the ground, coughing and shielding themselves from falling debris, while officers immediately initiated emergency protocols, calling roll and checking for injuries. Tactical assessments were recorded with cold precision. Primary ingress blocked, structural instability confirmed, personnel accounted for, minor injuries. The detritus of the collapse created a physical and psychological barrier, compressing the unit into the dark interior where shadows seemed unnaturally long and oppressive. With the entrance sealed, the soldiers confronted dwindling supplies. Rations and water, calculated for standard operations, were now insufficient for an unknown duration. Flashlights and lanterns flickered against the dust-laden air, revealing walls smeared with mud and loose rock. Officers logged, consumption rates adjusted, ration protocols enacted, morale observed to be declining under sustained stress conditions. Every attempt to dig through the rubble was met with frustration. Rockfalls shifted unpredictably, and unstable ceilings made every excavation effort perilous. Even experienced miners in the unit expressed concern. The natural geology of the limestone caverns was unpredictable, prone to sudden collapses and hidden crevices. As the unit moved deeper into the tunnels to search for alternate exits, the cave itself seemed to mock their efforts. Passages twisted in ways previously unmapped, Corridors that had been solid minutes before now appeared blocked or rerouted, forcing soldiers to double back in disorienting loops. Officers' notes emphasized the procedural efforts to maintain cohesion. Team members instructed to remain within visual contact, paths marked with chalk and string, spatial disorientation observed. Despite methodical marking, the soldiers reported glimpses of faint, pale lights deeper in the tunnels, always at the periphery, always disappearing when approached. Fear began to escalate. Soldiers murmured about shadows that appeared to stretch and shift independently of light sources. Every corner seemed to extend farther than physically possible, each narrow chamber closing in as if the mountain itself were compressing their movements. Tactical briefings were held in hushed, strained voices, and soldiers were reminded of emergency evacuation drills, though each member instinctively felt the futility of escape. The natural echo of their voices became distorted, bouncing irregularly off the jagged walls, reinforcing a creeping sense of isolation. Psychological strain manifested in subtle ways. Sleep-deprived and tense, some soldiers began retracing paths they had already taken, convinced new corridors had appeared. Others insisted they could hear footsteps behind them, despite roll calls confirming every member's location. Even experienced officers recorded in their logs. Environmental assessment indicates nonlinear corridor progression, psychological impact significant, perception of spatial orientation compromised. Every attempt to locate a viable exit only reinforced the unit's growing terror. By the end of the observation period, the soldiers understood the grim reality. The cave network was no longer a passive terrain, but an active agent shaping their fate. The faint lights beckoned, yet the walls closed and corridors twisted as if anticipating their movements. Every tactical adjustment seemed futile, every plan undermined by the shifting labyrinth. Equipment and training offered little comfort against a system that appeared sentient, controlling both environment and perception. The officer's final report concluded clinically, yet with an undercurrent of dread. Escape was no longer an option, it was a trap. The mountain had claimed the primary exit, leaving the unit confined within a shifting, oppressive underworld from which there seemed no return. As the unit advanced deeper into the cave network, the oppressive darkness began to shift subtly, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Headlamps flickered across damp stone, and the soldiers' footsteps echoed in the narrow tunnels with an unnatural clarity. Then, at the edge of perception, movement stirred. Faint silhouettes on the ridges of the rock walls, humanoid shapes that vanished when directly observed. The soldiers froze, scanning the shadows with trained eyes, noting that these forms were not mere illusions. There was a presence, deliberate and patient. Glowing points of light reflected back from the depths, like eyes, unblinking and impossibly bright in the darkness. Officers instructed calm and documentation, but even the most disciplined members of the unit felt a tightening in the chest, a creeping sense of scrutiny. Soldiers attempted to signal or call out, their voices absorbed and distorted by the labyrinthine corridors. When a gesture was made, the Watchers, if that was what they were, mirrored it almost perfectly, pausing for a fraction of a second before mimicking each movement. Every hand raise, every tilt of the head was replicated. The unit's own shadows, cast by the flickering lights, seemed to animate independently, twisting and stretching along the walls, no longer obeying the source that created them. Clinical notes recorded by the officers emphasized the precision of observation. Multiple humanoid entities detected, eyes luminous, movement deliberate. Environmental conditions, low light, damp stone, may exacerbate optical misperceptions. Yet the soldiers' testimony was unanimous. The Watchers were sentient, aware, and analyzing the humans. Attempts to trace them with infrared scanners yielded nothing. Thermal readings reflected only the soldiers themselves. The unit began marking positions, leaving chalk outlines on walls. Yet the entities always maintained an unreachable distance, just beyond direct line of sight. The psychological impact was immediate. Fear heightened perceptual sensitivity, causing minor movements to appear amplified, echoes to seem like voices, and faint shapes to solidify into figures. Officers recorded increasing heart rates, shallow breathing, and signs of hypervigilance. One soldier reported that his shadow detached entirely, moving ahead of him in a corridor that twisted impossibly, reflecting gestures he had not made. Attempts to rationalize these experiences were futile. The cognitive dissonance between training and perception created a pervasive unease, leaving the unit questioning reality itself. Even under observation, the Watchers remained silent. They did not attack, but their gaze, or whatever constituted it, felt penetrating, as if the soldiers' intentions and fears were transparent. Tactical instructions were followed robotically, yet with every cautious step forward, the sense of being analyzed intensified. The dim glow from their own equipment cast long, stretching shadows that danced across the walls, interacting unpredictably with the mirrored movements of the Watchers. By the end of the documented period, the soldiers recognized an alarming truth. They were no longer simply navigating the cave network. They were part of an experiment, observed by entities whose motives were unknowable. The clinical report concluded in stark, detached language. Unit reports visual confirmation of humanoid observers. Shadows manifest independently. Environmental stressors significant. The subjects were being copied and studied. The cave had revealed its intelligence, and for the first time, the Watchers had stepped into view. As the unit pressed deeper into the labyrinthine cave network, the oppressive fog and dim lamplight began to warp perception. Time itself seemed to falter. Wristwatches halted inexplicably. Pendulum-like timers froze mid-swing, and logs recorded sequences that contradicted previous entries. Footsteps echoed unnaturally, repeating in loops as if the tunnels themselves were mocking the soldiers' progress. Orders given moments before were recalled differently by each member, producing confusion and tension that spread through the unit like a contagion. The soldiers' logs and communications, meticulously maintained, began to fragment. One officer recorded an advance toward the northern shaft at 0347 hours, while another's log indicated the same maneuver occurring at 0413 hours. Yet both swore to the accuracy of their recollections. Voices over the radio relayed commands already executed, some duplicated, some entirely fabricated. Attempts to cross-reference timestamps revealed inconsistencies too precise to be random, too surreal to be dismissed as error. In narrow tunnels, shadows stretched and flickered in ways that defied the position of lamps and headlamps. Soldiers reported glimpses of themselves performing actions they had not initiated, closing doors, checking equipment, or pausing to observe phantom lights. Some recalled prior events differently. A conversation held moments before in one soldier's memory never occurred in another's. These temporal discrepancies escalated anxiety, eroding trust in both equipment and each other. Observational notes highlight that cognitive stress, sleep deprivation, and sensory deprivation likely compounded these perceptual anomalies. Officers documented rapid pulse, shallow breathing, and mounting confusion, yet could not account for simultaneous experiences that conflicted with physical evidence. Equipment readings, when reviewed, confirmed mechanical normality. Clocks remained halted, radios were functional, yet the reality perceived by the soldiers fractured. Hallucinations emerged with increasing frequency, fleeting figures in peripheral vision, repeated footsteps echoing from empty corridors, and the illusion of walls subtly shifting. Attempts to stabilize the unit's understanding of space and time proved futile. Standard navigational markers, chalk lines, mapped intersections, and torch placements appeared to alter positions when unobserved, reinforcing the notion that the mountain itself was exerting influence over perception. Individual soldiers reported déjà vu, but with slight variations in outcome or dialogue, as though the environment rewrote events on a personal timeline. Despite the detachment maintained in their after-action reports, the clinical observations convey a profound sense of terror. The caves not only disoriented the body but manipulated memory, forcing each soldier to confront the unreliability of their own senses. Tactical decisions became increasingly reactive rather than deliberate, guided by instinct and fear rather than clarity. The air, thick with mist and the metallic scent of stone, seemed to pulse with anticipation, amplifying every footstep and echo until reality itself felt unstable. By the end of the documented period, the team collectively recognized a horrifying truth. Events could no longer be trusted. memories no longer reliable. The mountain had begun to assert control over perception, manipulating time, duplicating sequences, and implanting inconsistencies into the soldier's consciousness. The final observation of the report, noted in precise, detached language, reads, temporal and perceptual distortions observed, cognitive effects extreme. Environment appears to influence memory and sensory input. The mountain was rewriting their memories. As the unit progressed through the increasingly claustrophobic cave network, the soldiers began to perceive whispers that seemed to emerge from the very stone around them. Initially dismissed as echoes or the wind churning through the labyrinthine tunnels, the murmurs soon took on recognizable patterns, fragments of conversations, the cadence of orders once given by fallen comrades, and even the voices of enemies long silenced in the mountain's depths. Each whisper carried an uncanny clarity, filtered through shadows and rock, yet impossible to trace to any physical source. The soldiers' logs document a growing pattern, names called with precision, phrases previously spoken during combat repeated verbatim, and confessions of guilt or fear that no one alive could know. The audio hallucinations were not random. They seemed directed, urging the soldiers toward narrow passages, steep drops, and hidden chambers deep within the cave system. One private swore he heard his own voice issuing commands he had not given, guiding him to a fissure where faint light glimmered. Another noted the whisper of an officer, long dead in Afghanistan, warning of a turn that leads nowhere. Investigators reviewing the logs later emphasized the complex acoustic properties of Tora Bora's caves. Reverberations, narrow passage resonance, and natural amplification could account for echoes, but could not explain the precise replication of personal phrases, voices, and commands. Some passages appear to create overlapping sound loops, where whispers interlace with footsteps, making orientation difficult and heightening paranoia. Soldiers attempted to mark the paths they were led through, yet each turn seemed unfamiliar despite prior mapping efforts. The tension within the unit escalated rapidly. Soldiers argued over whether to follow the guidance or resist it, fearing the whispers were a psychological trap. Attempts to communicate with radio devices inside the tunnels yielded only static punctuated by muffled, intelligible phrases that seemed responsive to questions, yet inconsistent with reality. This dissonance fractured command structures. Orders were given and immediately questioned, and trust eroded under the weight of auditory manipulation. Despite the mounting fear, soldiers documented their compliance with the voices, noting that the whispers sometimes led them to hidden water sources or structurally stable chambers, survival benefits that blurred the line between guidance and malevolent entrapment. The unit began to perceive a rhythm in the cacophony, a pattern that seemed almost intentional, as if the mountain had preserved a memory of every life that had passed through its tunnels, replaying fragments to influence the living. The psychological effects were profound. Logs reveal soldiers experiencing brief lapses in memory, recalling events that never occurred or hearing warnings after the fact. Sleep deprivation, stress, and claustrophobia intensified the hallucinations, making every corridor a potential conduit for past voices. The boundary between memory, history, and immediate perception disintegrated. The cave acted as both archive and predator, cataloging and manipulating the unit's experience. By the end of the documented period, the soldiers' observations coalesced into a chilling conclusion. The whispers were not merely echoes but active agents shaping their movements. Every instruction carried the dual possibility of aid or death, and compliance was indistinguishable from coercion. The final line in the archival report, written in detached, clinical tones, reads, "They were being guided or lured to their deaths." As panic reached its apex, the unit began to fracture. What had once been a disciplined formation of soldiers, trained for combat and mountain operations, now splintered into smaller, desperate groups, each attempting to navigate the treacherous cave network independently. Orders were shouted and ignored. Cohesion dissolved under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Headlamps bobbed erratically, illuminating walls that seemed to shift subtly when glanced at from different angles, corridors stretching and contracting as though the tunnels themselves were alive. Groups moved cautiously at first, marking walls with chalk and string to track their progress, but soon realized that previously marked paths led them back to their starting points. A private in one team swore he had counted 50 steps before emerging at the same junction he had left 20 minutes earlier. Attempts to use compasses and handheld GPS devices were futile. Magnetic anomalies and signal interference rendered standard navigation tools unreliable. Even experienced scouts could not reconcile their mental maps with the reality before them. The environment amplified psychological strain. Echoes from distant chambers distorted commands and footsteps, making it impossible to locate other members of the unit. Some soldiers reported glimpses of comrades ahead, only to find empty corridors when they arrived. Others described hearing laughter, whispers, or voices repeating their own words, directing them along paths that seemed increasingly labyrinthine. The tunnels, cold and damp, exuded a palpable oppression, each wall pressing inward as if to squeeze both body and mind. Medical and field notes recorded rapidly rising heart rates, shallow breathing, and tremors among the troops, classic signs of acute stress and panic. Debriefings later highlighted that isolation and repeated sensory confusion in complex subterranean environments could produce cognitive distortions, hallucinations, and extreme distrust, all of which the mountain appeared to exploit. Soldiers argued bitterly over which route to follow, accusing each other of sabotage or cowardice, further fracturing unit cohesion. Despite the chaos, some groups attempted methodical exploration, marking turns and tallying steps. Yet, the more methodical they became, the less reliable the environment seemed. Corridors looped, exits vanished, and familiar landmarks appeared in impossible configurations. The soldiers' attempts to maintain tactical procedures and map the network were rendered useless by what they could only describe as the cave itself intervening. Psychological horror deepened as it became evident that the mountain was not a passive environment. It appeared to manipulate their movements, controlling which groups advanced, which retreated, and which became lost entirely. Communication between splintered groups was erratic at best. Radios crackled intermittently, transmitting garbled static punctuated by voices that seemed both familiar and alien. Instructions given by one group were heard by another at a delay, sometimes inverted or distorted. Soldiers began to question whether the mountain merely confounded them or actively sought to separate, confuse, and test their resolve. Every step carried uncertainty. Every fork in the path became a potential trap. By the end of the recorded period, it was clear that panic, isolation, and the uncanny geography of the tunnels had irreparably fractured the unit. Even those who maintained their composure could not resist the sense of inevitable predestination, as though the mountain itself were selecting who would continue and who would be left behind. Archival notes close with a chilling, detached observation. The mountain was deciding who survived. The remaining survivors pressed forward through the cavernous tunnels, senses taut, every nerve alert to the faintest movement. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, stretching and compressing in ways that defied logic, and the air seemed to thrum with a silent attention that was palpably watching. Then they saw them, the Watchers. At first, the figures were peripheral, glimpsed in the flickering edges of headlamp light. Humanoid in shape, yet impossibly distorted, limbs elongated or bent at angles no human joint could sustain, heads tilting in quiet scrutiny. Their presence was both mesmerizing and profoundly disorienting. Attempts to communicate, shouts, gestures, even hand signals, failed. The Watchers mirrored every action, yet never responded in a recognizably human manner. One soldier raised his rifle, a Watcher did the same, mirroring posture with exactitude, but the expressionless face was alien, unblinking. The psychological toll was immediate. The soldiers' hearts raced, and a creeping sense of unreality settled over the group. For every step the soldiers took, the Watchers matched it perfectly, creating the disquieting impression that the mountain itself had been populated by these observers all along. As they advanced deeper, the most unnerving phenomenon emerged. One Watcher approached with deliberate slowness, then froze at eye level with a soldier. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it assumed his exact stance, copying gestures and expressions down to the smallest twitch. The soldier stared at the reflection of himself, yet it was not him. Panic surged. His voice trembled as he called out, only to hear the Watcher mimic his words perfectly, with an unsettling precision. The boundary between self and other blurred. It became impossible to distinguish human from watcher. Identity itself felt fragile, eroded by the silent, observing force. Archival notes record the physiological responses, accelerated heart rates, shallow breathing, and the onset of dissociative episodes. Stress and fear magnified perception. Even trained soldiers, conditioned for combat and survival, struggled to maintain composure. Shadows elongated further, responding not just to light but to thought, as if the watchers anticipated action before it was taken. Attempting to retreat only intensified the mimicry. Each hesitant movement was immediately mirrored, every signal and glance captured and studied. Tension escalated as the soldiers attempted tactical coordination. A sergeant ordered movement to the left. One watcher matched exactly. Another appeared behind him, copying even the subtle tilt of his helmet. The soldiers' confidence in their own observations eroded completely. Eyes darted nervously, seeking confirmation of identity, only to find the watchers indistinguishable from themselves. A whispered observation in one log reads, "In confronting them, we confront ourselves, and perhaps lose what defines us." By the time the unit attempted to regroup, the watchers had perfected a form of psychological dominance. Their mimicry was not merely imitation. It was interrogation, study, and subtle erasure of the self. Every soldier who faced a watcher was forced to question the reality of their own existence. Was the soldier in front of them real, or had they already become the watcher? The archival record ends with a chilling notation. Who was real, and who had become the watcher? The mountain groaned with an unholy resonance as tunnels began to collapse around the remaining soldiers. Dust choked the air, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and the scent of crushed stone and displaced earth filled every inhalation. Rocks fell unpredictably, shattering on the floor or bouncing along jagged walls, forcing the soldiers to crawl and cling to the uneven surfaces for purchase. Their ears rang with the compounded noise of fractures and distant reverberations, and the claustrophobic corridors seemed to compress with each tremor, as if the mountain itself were breathing and watching. Sensory deprivation intensified the terror. Darkness was absolute. Headlamps flickered against dust-laden air, casting fractured shadows that merged with the rubble. The soldiers could hear only the scraping of boots against jagged stone, their own breaths, and the occasional panicked shouts that dissolved instantly into the cavern's hollow depths. Attempting to navigate, every familiar tunnel seemed to twist and distort. Even maps and digital sensors offered no reliable guidance. The passages had become unpredictable, looping back on themselves or vanishing entirely behind fallen rock. Amid the chaos, psychological strain reached a fever pitch. Soldiers began reliving the final moments of those who had disappeared earlier in the operation. Whispers and indistinct cries echoed through the tunnels, sometimes perfectly mimicking their own voices. One soldier froze as he felt a hand brush his shoulder, only to realize no one was there. Another found his own reflection, or that of someone identical to him, trapped in the contours of the rubble. Archival notations record these instances as extreme stress-induced hallucinations, yet survivors describe them as palpably real. The environmental hazards compounded the terror. Each step risked dislodging further rock, sending plumes of dust into already constricted breathing space. Sounds of fractures from unseen areas made it impossible to determine which tunnels were safe. Emergency protocols were followed as best as possible: low-profile movement, buddy checks, and minimal exposure to potential collapse zones. Still, the mountain seemed aware, responding to the unit's efforts by shifting its passages, redirecting escape attempts, and intensifying disorientation. As they moved deeper, the survivors began to understand a horrifying truth. Some of the team were already dead, their consciousness lingering in the caves in a manner that defied rational explanation. Every step, every fallen stone, seemed to replay the last actions of those lost. Equipment left behind moved subtly, as if guided by unseen hands. Echoes of prior screams overlapped with current panic, and the line between living and deceased blurred entirely. By the time the unit reached a chamber partially intact, exhaustion and terror dominated every movement. Eyes strained against darkness, ears tuned to every subtle sound, and minds frayed under the relentless pressure of survival. The mountain had become both the trap and the torturer, compressing reality into a nightmarish loop where time, identity, and survival were indistinguishable. The archival report concludes with a final, chilling observation. The mountain had consumed reality itself. The sole survivor emerged from the shattered network of tunnels, coated in dust and exhaustion, yet carrying an expression that betrayed more than fatigue. His eyes darted constantly toward the jagged cliffs and lingering fog of the Tora Bora Mountains, as though expecting figures that should not exist. Military medics and debriefing officers recorded every word and movement with clinical detachment, yet the survivors' responses were fragmented. Pauses, shifts in gaze, and murmurs hinting at experiences beyond rational comprehension. Every question was answered cautiously. Some were left unspoken, the memories inaccessible or too horrifying to articulate. The landscape outside was monochrome in the early dawn light, rocks jagged and slick with residual snow, mist curling around the peaks. The survivor described the caves in clinical terms: passage widths, ceiling heights, tunnel junctions, but his voice trembled when recounting moments of sensory distortion. He spoke of shadows that moved independently, whispers that echoed names, and the sensation of being watched at every turn. Observers noted elevated heart rate and shallow breathing, indicative of both physical strain and acute psychological trauma. His statements were cross-referenced with satellite imagery and field logs. Anomalies were recorded, footprints appearing in formations impossible for one person to create, faint heat signatures that moved against natural terrain patterns, and signals captured in abandoned radios long after the unit's last transmission. Despite official reassurances that the area had been secured, the survivors' accounts suggested otherwise. He described corridors that had seemed to shift, hiding exits and revealing new passages, and shadows that mimicked the team in perfect detail. Some officers speculated these were hallucinations, the brain's response to extreme stress and isolation. Yet the satellite evidence and autonomous sensors indicated patterns inconsistent with natural phenomena. As the survivor walked the perimeter during debriefing exercises, lingering movements were detected in fog patches that should have been empty. Each observation reinforced a chilling possibility. The Watchers remained, unseen but influential. Psychological evaluation noted severe dissociation, amnesia for certain periods, and acute hypervigilance. Field notes recorded instances of the survivor pausing mid-sentence to glance behind him, muttering about figures in the fog, and occasionally freezing as though hearing commands from the cave system itself. Medical officers documented both the survivor's physical resilience and his profound mental fragility. The archival record emphasized the incongruence between physiological evidence and his subjective experiences. No other personnel or environmental hazard could account for the lingering impressions, yet the survivor's distress was palpable, real, and unignorable. Even after extraction from the mountain, anomalies persisted. Reconnaissance drones captured fleeting heat signatures in restricted areas of the Tora Bora peaks. Remote sensors logged movements synchronized with no human operator. Communications relays intercepted faint, repeating echoes that corresponded to the survivors' reported auditory hallucinations. Analysts reviewing the logs concluded that the presence of the Watchers was not confined to the caves. They had extended into the surrounding terrain, leaving traces detectable long after the unit's disappearance. The survivor, unaware of these confirmations, remained haunted by invisible eyes, his memories incomplete and shadowed. As the debrief concluded and the survivor was escorted to temporary quarters, archival officers documented a final observation. The mountain had retained its Watchers, its influence lingering, silent but undeniable. The fog clung to the peaks as if guarding secrets yet unrevealed. The official report ended on a note of unresolved dread, summarizing both human survival and persistent mystery. The Watchers of Tora Bora remain, and they are still waiting. The mountain remains silent, yet the Watchers endure, waiting for the next intruders into their domain. What really stalks the Tora Bora caves? And how many secrets have been buried by time and fear? If you want more stories of war, mystery, and the horrors that history tried to hide, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Comment below, would you dare enter the caves, knowing what might be waiting? Stay alert, because on Battlefield Secrets, the shadows are always watching.